We're now into week 8. We're still in module 3, where we're looking at how political theories of the family were formulated in response to the women's and sexual liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s in the US. We've looked, as you know, at Rawls's liberal theory of the family and at Susan Moller-Ocken's liberal feminist criticisms of Rawls. We've looked also at communitarian and conservative criticisms of liberal versions. And we've looked at neoliberal theories of the family and the family's role in economies. And this week, in the final week of this module, we're turning to radical and queer criticisms of liberal theory, how families reproduce exclusionary norms in relation to gender identification and race. So as we've done in every week so far, we begin with the historical context and we try and map out how divisive conflict gave rise to a need to think through how or why we face these problems and how we might resolve them. Where the political theorist was nothing more than a citizen trying to use reason to persuade other people to think about the issue in particular ways. We'll begin by recalling our preliminary note on language and gender as we did in week 6. We'll recall our sweeping and contested history of competing perspectives on gendered injustices as a broader context for the women's and sexual liberation movements of the 1960s. We'll extend that still further to a consideration of why criticisms arose from the late 20th century up to the present of the conceptions of sex and gender that liberal feminists relied on. Contestations that are present in this week's second and third readings. And then we'll look at this week's readings. We'll place those readings in that contested history. We'll look at Bell Hooks, the first required reading, who brings a criticism of the inapplicability of white middle-class feminist claims of the 1960s and 1970s to the needs and interests of African American, non-white and poor white women. And we'll look at Kathi Weeks's reading, also a required reading from 2023, very recent, and Claudia Card, a recommended reading. These are texts that revisit the ongoing relevance of radical criticisms of the family, which were developed in the 1960s and 1970s, but were not nearly so popular or widespread as the liberal feminist versions. They were very different to Ocken's revisionist liberal feminist criticisms. So we'll locate the readings in that history. Then we'll turn to the details of these theories. We'll look at radical and queer political theories of the family, and we'll end with some critical considerations. So to turn first to historical context and the divisive conflicts around conceptions of the family that were visible in the women's and sexual liberation movements, and the debates about family that have emerged since then. How those initial debates in the 60s and 70s have set the terrain and vocabulary for the way we speak about families today. You'll remember from week 6 that we looked at a potted history, an inaccurate history of how gendered injustices had been conceptualised from the 19th century to the present, looking at how the first, second and third waves of feminist thought tend to be presented, and some of the problems involved in that sort of presentation. Now we're able to turn to problems with liberal feminist conceptions of sex and gender and their implications for injustice. Having studied the work of Susan Moller-Ocken ourselves in week 6, we saw in week 6 how Susan Moller-Ocken's liberal feminist criticisms of Rawls circulated around the idea that there really was no good reason why women should have different outcomes, experiences and treatments as an effect of their role in families, just because of their sexual difference with men. And this provides a clue to how liberal feminists in political philosophy, economics and other disciplines have conceptualised the relationship between sex and gender. Sex has been mostly conceptualised by the liberal feminists as a natural difference between male and female, with gender constructed on the top of that brute difference. The idea is that gendered differences as social constructs can be overcome. In philosophy, Susan Moller-Ocken, we saw, conceptualised the sex-gender relation in this way. And in economics for a long time, the key founding feminists in the late 1980s, Nancy Folbre, Julie Nelson and others did likewise. But also in the 1980s, the early 1980s, drawing on French philosophers like Derrida, Althusser, Foucault and others, the US gender theorist Judith Butler and others questioned whether it really was possible to clearly demarcate sexual difference as natural from gender as constructed. In Australia, Moira Gatens made a similar argument. Gender is not to culture as sex is to nature, writes Judith Butler. Gender itself is also the discursive cultural means by which sexed nature or a natural sex is produced and established as pre-discursive. What that means is that the idea of sex as natural is actually a product of conceptual frameworks that we use to make sense of these differences. So Judith Butler felt able to claim that there really is no recourse to a body, a natural body, that has not already been interpreted by cultural meanings. And this allowed them to claim that the very male-female sex binary was only able to be formulated through conceptual frameworks that were themselves socially constructed. This led to a revisiting of sexual difference as an effect of culture. Similarly, the very concept of gender as constructed rather than as natural was itself positioned as an effect of socially constructed conceptual frameworks for making sense of the world. There was no access to the natural apart from the conceptual frameworks that allowed us to access sexual difference as if it was natural. What this meant was that the founding categories of injustice and inequality had been unable to access all sorts of injustices. For me, and this is my view here, this did not make liberal feminist concerns meaningless or redundant. They remain, in my view, relevant and important. However, it did mean that it became necessary to secure greater visibility for injustices experienced by queer, trans, non-binary people, for whom gender identity is central to their marginalisation. So that's how I've now come to understand this history of how liberal feminists have conceptualised sex and its relation to gender and the implications for injustice. And that's relevant for how we understand families and the text that we're reading today rely in a sense on a background understanding of these competing ways of understanding the relationship between sex and gender. So without background context to allow us to then move to the texts for this week as required reading, I'm now also able to note, as I did in week 6, how I will use language and gender. As I did with in the week where we were looking at Martin Luther King, I explained how I would be referring to race. So there now exists increasing scholarly recognition of the limits of binary definitions of biological sex and constructed gender. And I will be using the terms woman and man as the required readings refer to them, so as to reflect how people in the second half of the 20th century defined these terms during the women's and sexual liberation movements and in the decades following. I would do this in order to acknowledge and affirm the significant role these concepts and identities have played in earlier times and their ongoing relevance in understanding historically informed injustices that are still prevalent today. However, following Ross and Solange's recommendations in reproductive justice, I acknowledge the contemporary need to use language that reflects, quote, a range of gender identities and the diversity of people's experiences in a context of rapidly evolving conventions. This week, we will thus also explain why queer and radical criticisms of liberal conceptions of the family have involved an implicit and explicit criticism of how liberal feminists have defined sex and gender. So my current view, since this is a subject on political philosophy, where we are all political philosophers presenting our views that we hope will be reasonable to others who also share a commitment to public reason. My current view is that liberal feminist concerns are still helpful today, because similar historically informed injustices that were of concern to Susan Moller-Ocken, who we read in week 6, and others, really do remain prevalent in contemporary times. My current view is also that queer and radical criticisms allow us to secure necessary visibility for injustices that were not visible in past times, that had been rendered less clear due to the conceptual frameworks that were dominant. So I share Ross and Solange's view that we do need to ensure that our language and conceptual frameworks evolve to reflect diverse experiences, diverse identifications, and the full variety as much as possible of injustices. So one aim of political philosophy is to show how political theory has emerged in a historical context. And we can see that the conceptual frameworks that have emerged in the 1960s and 70s in response to these different social movements were formulated in response to problems. And now we're also facing new and emerging problems. And so we're called upon to build upon the past and move beyond the past. Let's turn now to a consideration of Bell Hooks's radical account of revolutionary parenting and queer political theories of the family in the work of Kathi and others. Your first required reading for this week is by Bell Hooks on revolutionary parenting. Bell Hooks, a little on Bell Hooks first, was born as Gloria Jean Watkins, but early on in her life she decided as an avid writer to change her name to a pen name that would honour her maternal great-grandmother, whose name she then used. But she chose not to capitalise her name as a strategy to allow her to ask for a focus on her books and not on who she was herself. It was part and parcel of a feminist commitment to prioritising collective struggle over the individual. In a text you're asked to read today, the first key idea, in my view, is that the major claims of the women's and sexual liberation movement reflected the race and class biases of the participants in those movements, who were white, middle-class, college-educated and housebound. Bell Hooks' key idea, her first key idea, is that black women's problems were different. Black women did not experience the same problems. They did not experience motherhood or child rearing as a serious obstacle to their liberation. They were not confined to the home. In a manner similar to the women of a Leninist Soviet Union, black women wanted to be able to salvage time to spend with their children at home. They did not want to work in menial, badly paid, disrespected labour, exhausting labour. Quote, "From slavery to the present day," Hooks writes, "black women in the US have worked outside the home, in the fields, in the factories, in the laundries, in the homes of others." End quote. The work was badly paid and interfered with or prevented effective parenting. So for Hooks, the key problem really wasn't the sorts of issues, motherhood and child rearing and so forth, that white middle-class college-educated housebound women experience as their own problem. But really it was a racism, a lack of jobs, lack of skills, education, and other issues that were problematic. The second key idea we find in Bell Hooks' text is that liberal solutions to the problem of women's oppression were not designed for black women, or even for poor white women who have always worked. Liberals like Susan Moller-Ocken from Week 6 wanted, we recall, childcare to allow mothers to work, policies to promote the sharing by both parents of household labour, and protections in the case of divorce, no-fault divorce, for those women who had worked without wages in homes so that they would not be financially disadvantaged or destitute from a divorce. But these policies were, according to Bell Hooks, mainly for white middle-class women. Black women wanted other things. They wanted other solutions. For Hooks, they need institutions that will not diffuse values that present motherhood as a compulsory experience, and values that will not make motherhood an exploitative and or oppressive experience. Black women, according to Hooks, need cultural change that facilitates effective parenting by men too, non-sexist parenting. This, in my view, is similar to Ocken, because we remember from Week 6 that Ocken thought that children growing up in families where household labour wasn't shared, would have an impaired sense of justice. Hooks tends to agree, in third place, that partners should share responsibility for child rearing, but she goes further than Ocken does. Hooks wants to remind us that childcare and its provision by states has been racist and sexist. So there's a desire for community-based child rearing of a communal nature, which is not necessarily provided for by states who have historically been racist. Black women did not, in Hooks' view, trust a childcare centre to adequately raise their children. For Hooks, black women also needed social structures that supported single motherhood. And they wanted shorter working days, better pay, and security of income. We now turn to the second required reading. So Hooks had been concerned to show how liberal feminist concerns were primarily the concerns of the white middle class, educated women, housebound women, who were uniting in consciousness-raising activities and trying to secure opportunities to work. Bell hooks didn't think that black women were interested in these issues because they had always worked, they were always exhausted, and they wanted more than anything quality time with their children to mother effectively. Kathi Weeks presents a different view. She thinks that the family should be abolished. In a recent article of 2023, she returns to rather marginal claims of the 1970s, where this abolitionist account was also defended. The 1970s, as she explains, also saw the rise not just of the predominant liberal feminist criticisms of the family, like the ones that we looked at in week 6, like Susan Moller-Ockens. The 1970s also saw the rise of radical claims for a need to abolish families. Weeks begins by summarising the two major thrusts of the 1970s radical claims, and she finds Linda Gordon to be one of the crucial proponents of this view. Linda Gordon has also provided a really fantastic history of abortion and contraception in US politics. So Linda Gordon and others, they're thinking of these abolitionist radical feminists, had two major thrusts, and the first was an aspiration to systems thinking with a focus on social structures. The family, on this view, was a social and economic institution enforced through economic constraints, juridical rule, and the manufacture of consent. And the radicals wanted to criticise that manufactured consent for its effects on women. The second thrust was a critique that refused reform as a remedy. The idea was to transform not the family, but the society that needs it. But as Kathi Weeks points out, these radical abolitionist claims and demands were quickly scaled down due to objections that were immediately raised by more moderate, reform-oriented liberal feminists. A first objection to the radical critique was that the family could, indeed, should be historically and ethnographically grounded in the diversity of real structures. Kath Weston was a proponent of this view. Kath Weston studied the kinship relationships of chosen people who offered support to each other beyond friendship in families that were constructed through choice, the families we choose, in Bayside, LA. Kath Weston was a sociologist, and she had a major impact upon an economist called Lee Badgett, whose work also engaged criticism of liberal feminist views of the economic role of women in families. The second objection to the radical critique contested the view that women were victims of external forces. So this reform-oriented objection to the radical criticism identified resistance to and negotiation of the structures that had subordinated women. The idea was that families were not just oppressive, but also, like any structure, families were institutions that permitted types of freedom. A third objection was that black families had historically functioned as a prime source of resistance to oppression in the context of slavery and racism. So the family could also, in some cases, be not simply oppressive, but actually a form of resistance. And these were some of the objections to the more radical claims that social structures really should be changed to make families redundant. So, through the various sections of the paper, Kathi Weeks tackles how the family has been related to social reproduction, to the couple, and to biogenetic kinship. The family, she argues, is a biogenetically centered mode of social belonging that makes other forms of social hierarchy seem natural when they aren't. For Weeks, this means that families make gender appear as essentialist, anchored in the naturalisation of the household division of labour according to gender. It makes class hierarchy appear natural too, as the effect of less productive families. The family tends to be imagined as a natural artefact, and this underwrites state power. Political societies are conceptualised as constructed on a nation of families. And the final way that families make other forms of social hierarchy seem natural when they're not is that families naturalise racial identity. They did so in the past through legal prohibitions on marrying beyond your race. And now that those de jure rules have gone, Weeks finds there to be de facto segregated family models that remain culturally dominant. So families really do naturalise racial identity too, she believes. The family also sustains the individualism of liberal economies. And it does so by securing privacy, with children being raised to be part of a labour force, individuals to receive a wage in a market. Weeks also thinks that the family's privacy makes women and children, particularly queer and trans children, particularly vulnerable in families. And this is because abuse is hidden from view by the expectation that families are where they are most protected. Finally, the privatisation of the family makes it seem like gendered divisions of labour are natural too. Weeks then turns in separate sections to how the family naturalises the couple when it needn't. And she makes a case for polyamory in family dynamics, or in social dynamics, not in family dynamics, and biogenetic kinship. Just as with the family and social reproduction, Weeks argues that the structuring of families around the couple and around biogenetic kinship has also produced power relations that do not benefit all persons. Kathi Weeks closes the article by considering what might replace the family. She argues that although these alternatives, these options may seem unrealistic, it's still important to explore alternatives. The first is an effort to fuel the political imagination, perhaps by expanding the concept of friendship, by disaggregating the roles that a single partner is required to fulfill, and by assigning some or all to different people in a way that would open infinite possibilities for different households, patterns of intimacy, and social networks. She accepts that some may continue to choose heterosexual coupledom. As for the second idea on what might replace the family, she notes that this might constitute an effort not to build up an alternative to the family, new forms of household to fulfill the needs families are supposed to fill today, but an effort to make the family less necessary by building up other ways to meet people's needs. This might involve some form of livable, minimal, guaranteed income, although there is scant detail on how this might work in practice. The other alternative might be shorter working hours, universal health care delinked from employment and from family membership, and more affordable housing to fit single residents and a variety of groups. So the benefit of this article is really in the diagnosis, and less so, to my mind, in the ideas about what might replace a family, since these are less developed, but interesting nonetheless. I've provided you here with some of the references that I've referred to in the slides for this lecture. And I look forward to discussing the material with you later in the week.